Hello and welcome to Public Law 2023. I'm Lindsay Stirton, Professor of Public Law at the University of Sussex, and I will be your module convener for the MA Public Law module. And I will be leading you on this module right up until week 5. The module is team taught, so you will have other lecturers after that. All this will become clear in time, but for now, welcome. I'm really looking forward to meeting you and to the many interesting discussions I expect we're going to have. If you are new to the study of law, as I expect most of you will be, you might be wondering, what is public law? I am not too keen on definitions as a rule. I think they often end up confusing more than helping. This is because often the way people use a term in practice is too varied to fit any particular definition. And it turns out that this is the case with public law as it is with many other things. But to get you started, I would say that in this module we will look at 3 core areas. First and foremost, constitutional law covers the internal composition of the state, its different organs and their powers and how these relate to each other. Next, administrative law concerns the specific powers and duties of executive government, government agencies, local authorities and the like, especially when the exercise of these powers and duties bring them into dispute with private persons. The famous Wednesbury case, for example, which you will soon learn about, arose when a chain of cinemas complained about the appropriateness of certain licence conditions which the local council imposed relating to the admission of children on Sundays. The cinema chain challenged the lawfulness of the decision in the High Court, unsuccessfully as it turned out. And third, human rights law is concerned with the special protections owed by public authorities in their dealings with individuals when certain rights are engaged. On the MA at Sussex, we concern ourselves with the protection that English law provides for the rights enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights. But we should remember that this is just one of a number of human rights conventions to which the UK is a signatory. One thing that I would urge is not to draw too sharp a distinction between these 3 areas. Just to give a simple example, if the Wednesbury case were to have come before the courts today, rather than in 1947, it would almost certainly have been argued on human rights grounds, as well as administrative law grounds. One of the arguments would have been that the licence conditions, restricting, as they did, the screening of movies to young people on Sundays, was a disproportionate interference with human rights, specifically the freedom of expression. Would the outcome have been different? I don't know. Human rights are not the trump card that some people would have you believe they are. But the basis for the decision would certainly have been different. And hence, so would the resulting rule that future decision makers would have to comply with. Let me say something about the nature and character of public law, and about the way that it's taught here at Sussex. The first thing to say about public law is that, inevitably, given its subject matter, there's a lot of politics involved in the teaching of the subject. This is what first drew me into the subject. And I know that one of the things that many students really like about this module is how they learn about the law of politics and how law and politics shape each other. But I also expect that some of you have never before taken an interest in politics or public affairs, and that, at least for some among you, learning more about politics and government won't endear you to the subject. If this describes you, then that's absolutely fine. We all have our likes and dislikes, and we encourage you to explore your own tastes and preferences, whatever they are. But public law is the law of the state, and it's inherently about politics, just as much as the law of corporations is inherently connected with corporate affairs. It should go without saying that we don't approach the subject from a party political point of view, and that all opinions and perspectives are welcome on this module. provided they are backed with evidence and argument. And unless you are particularly good at guessing, you won't even know which of any of the political parties I or any of your other lecturers support, although you may hear our views on some certain individual issues relevant to the module. Think of it like this. If you want to be an effective family lawyer, you would have to know something of the way families operate, the dynamics of how parents relate to their children and vice versa, the commitment that couples want to make to each other over the long term, and what happens when cohabiting couples fall out, and so on. The difference, I suppose, is that we all have some experience of family life, broadly defined, before we come to study law, whereas only a few of us have prior political experience or experience of government. In contrast with family law then, public law can sometimes seem remote and abstract, at least to begin with. But at the same time, one of the fun things about public law is that it is always topical. There is always something going on that you can read about in newspapers or learn about by watching the news on TV or listening on the radio that has a public law element, and the class project that you will complete asks you to think and write about public law in the news. Let's just take an example that was current this week as I was making this video. An important news story is that the Prime Minister, Mr. Sunak, announced certain changes in the government's policies on net zero, including a delay of 5 years until 2035 on the ban of sale of petrol cars in the UK. Now, I know many of you will have views about whether this proposed delay is good policy or not, but let's leave that aside and ask, what can we say about the public law dimension? There are lots of questions we could ask. What, if anything, is the legal basis for banning the sale of petrol cars in the first place? Or what new laws might be required? If so, what are the Prime Minister's powers in relation to the passage of such laws, and where does his power to change the policy come from? To give a flavour of our Constitution, I would instead highlight a statement from the Speaker of the House of Commons, my namesake Lindsay, in a statement to the House of Commons. Here's what the Speaker said. This is a major policy shift, and it should have been announced when the House was sitting. Members with very different views on this issue have expressed their disquiet on the way that this has been handled. This is not the way to do business. Ministers are answerable to MPs. We do not have a presidential system here. The House of Commons is where laws are made, national debates are had, and where statements should be made. So where does this requirement come from? That major policy changes should be announced in the House of Commons rather than made to the media or otherwise outside of Parliament. Is this correct as a matter of law? Well, as it turns out, the making of policy statements outside the House of Commons is regulated, but not by law. A document called the Ministerial Code states that when Parliament is in session, the most important announcements of government policy should be made in the first instance in Parliament. But what is the Ministerial Code, and what gives the Ministerial Code its authority? Well, the short answer is, in legal terms, not much. The Ministerial Code sets out the rules and standards expected of government ministers, and its enforcement is ultimately a matter for the Prime Minister. But the Ministerial Code is not self-standing. It didn't invent these rules out of nothing. It is what would technically be called a non-authoritative code, in that it reproduces in written form the unwritten conventions of the Constitution. Conventions are not law. Rather, they are what Albert Venn, one of the giants of constitutional law, called political morality, which can be distinguished from law in that they are not enforced by the courts. And it turns out that a surprising amount of our Constitution has its basis in convention rather than law. Without convention, there would be no Prime Minister, no cabinet, no regular procedure for appointment or replacement of ministers, and no prime ministerial powers or duties. So you might ask yourself, why would the Prime Minister, or anyone else for that matter, ever comply with constitutional convention, even if they didn't do so in this case? That turns out to be quite a complicated question, and one that we will study in the module, and I look forward to discussing with you. For now, I just wanted to convey a sense of this module. You might get the feeling, and you would be right, that public law can at times be a complicated and confusing subject. This is partly because, as I just said, its subject matter can be unfamiliar, and because of the absence of an authoritative written text as the core of the law of the state. One way of cutting through this confusion, in my view, is by comparative study of our Constitution alongside other constitutions of what are sometimes known as the Westminster model. In the first half of the module, we will look at the UK Constitution in comparison to some of those of other countries of the former empire, particularly Canada, Ireland, Jamaica and South Africa. We'll get to all of that, but I want to say that it is not my aim to reduce public law to a set of simple propositions that can be memorised and applied. It would do you a great disservice if I was to teach it in that way, because true understanding comes from wrestling with this complexity. There is a story about someone who attended a lecture given by the physicist Enrico Fermi. Afterwards, Fermi reported that they said, "Before I came here, I was confused about this subject. Having listened to your lecture, I am still confused, but on a higher level." That, I think, is a reasonable ambition for public law, to be confused but on a higher level, and to become comfortable being uncomfortable. But I promise that I will support you through this process of growth. For now, welcome, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.